At 11:47 p.m., October 23rd, 1935, Dutch Schultz made a decision that should have never crossed the mind of a sane man. A decision born not from strategy, but from fear wearing the mask of courage. Witnesses would later describe the moment as strangely quiet, as if the entire city had paused. One breath held between life and consequence, a glass trembling on a table, a match failing to light, a door swinging half open without a sound, signs so subtle they felt like the night trying to intervene, and failing. And in that silence, Schultz crossed a line that was never meant to be crossed, a line guarded by a man who didn't raise his voice, a man who didn't need threats, a man whose calm was more dangerous than any bullet. Lucky Luciano. Some say Schultz sealed his fate the second he acted. Others insist the ending had been written long before, but the truth is simpler, colder. When he made that move, he didn't just challenge Luciano. He triggered the end he feared most, and the city felt it. Because sometimes, a single impulse doesn't just destroy a man. It echoes through everyone who ever thought they were untouchable. And it all began at 11:47 p.m., on a quiet night that should have passed unnoticed, but didn't. At 11:47 p.m., October 23rd, 1935, the rain fell in thin, shimmering lines that blurred New York's lights into trembling strokes of gold across every wet surface. The city looked half-drowned in reflection, lamps bending, shadows stretching, as if the night itself were trying to obscure what was about to unfold. The rhythm of Manhattan felt uneven, like a heartbeat skipping every other beat. People hurried under awnings without knowing why. Taxi engines idled with a restless vibration, and somewhere beneath the city's ordinary noise, the underworld sensed a shift, something subtle, something fatal. Two figures moved through the storm, unaware that history had already begun tightening around them. Dutch Schultz walked with the agitation of a man who could hear threats that weren't yet spoken. Inside a dim speakeasy, its walls lined with peeling wallpaper and the stale scent of cheap gin, he paced like an animal trapped in a cage too small for its rage. Every flicker of light caught a new crack in his composure. He was a man whose empire was built on fear, yet he himself lived haunted by it. Across the city, Lucky Luciano exited a sedan with the poise of someone untouched by chaos. His coat hung neatly, his footsteps steady against the wet pavement. Luciano didn't need to raise his voice or brandish a weapon. His silence was command enough. He observed the world with a surgeon's precision, cool, detached, already calculating the consequences of actions not yet taken. Schultz was the storm. Luciano, the pressure before it, silent, heavy, inevitable. And on this night, both forces moved toward a collision neither could escape. Jazz music drifted faintly from hidden basement bars, but even that carried a muted dread, as though the musicians sensed a shift in the city's pulse. Everything felt like a warning disguised as atmosphere. No one knew exactly when the fragile balance of power cracked. But tonight, every reflection in every puddle seemed to shiver with the same truth. Something irreversible had begun. That night, one unthinkable gesture sealed the fate of Dutch Schultz, and of anyone who dared to cross Luciano's path. Dutch Schultz didn't rise in the underworld by charm or strategy. He rose the way storms rise, suddenly, violently, leaving people scrambling for shelter before they even understood what hit them. His beginnings were bleak, carved out of poverty and the gray corners of neighborhoods where opportunity came wrapped in danger. He learned early that the world didn't hand out respect. You took it, and if someone refused to give it, you took something else instead. The empire he eventually built didn't shimmer with sophistication. It pulsed with intimidation. Underground gambling parlors, extortion networks, backroom deals sealed with trembling hands. Schultz ruled through pressure, unpredictable, erratic pressure that made men obey not out of loyalty, but out of sheer dread. Those who encountered him never forgot the atmosphere around him, the smell of cheap cigarettes clinging to his coat, the stale humidity of cramped bars where whispers followed him like ghosts, the narrow hallways that seemed to shrink whenever he walked through them. His presence turned even the simplest conversation into a negotiation for survival. But for all his swagger, his violence, his reckless bravado, there was something deeper running under his skin, something corrosive. Paranoia seeped into his bones long before the world realized it. Schultz lived with the constant feeling that eyes were on him, that plots were forming in rooms he couldn't see, that every shadow held a threat waiting to step forward. Sometimes the danger was real. Sometimes it was of his own making. He never learned the difference, and as the city grew louder with ambition and greed, Schultz grew more volatile. His temper flared without warning. He trusted no one for more than a heartbeat. Even his closest men knew to watch for the subtle twitch in his jaw, the tightening grip on a glass, the pause before he spoke, small signals that meant the ground was about to shift beneath their feet. He was powerful, yes, but power meant nothing if it couldn't quiet the noise in his mind. Underneath every outburst, every brutal order, every act of dominance, there was a fear he refused to acknowledge. A fear that didn't come from the police or rival gangs or the newspaper headlines that painted him as a menace. It came from something colder, more precise, more dangerous than all of them. A man who planned instead of reacted. A man who understood the game at a depth Schultz could never reach. A man whose silence carried more weight than Schultz's most explosive threats. Lucky Luciano. Even Schultz, in his wildest moments, knew the truth he would never speak out loud. The only thing more terrifying than losing control was crossing someone who never lost it. Lucky Luciano did not conquer the underworld with noise. He conquered it with silence, sharp, deliberate, and unnervingly calm. While other men fought for territory with guns drawn and tempers blazing, Luciano played a different game entirely. His battlefield was the room before the confrontation, the pause before the argument, the moment when most men acted without thinking. Luciano waited, watched, calculated, and by the time others realized what he was doing, the decision had already been made. He carried himself like someone who understood gravity differently from the rest of the world. His footsteps were measured, almost fluid, and his gaze had a steadiness that unsettled even the bravest soldiers. Men who sat across from him often felt exposed, as if he could see past their words, past their bravado, straight into the motives they tried to hide. Luciano didn't need to raise his voice. His presence alone adjusted the temperature of any room. While Schultz built his empire through fear, Luciano built his through structure, order, logic. He saw the chaos tearing through the city and imagined something cleaner beneath it. A network, a council, an organization that operated like a machine instead of a brawl. And he turned that idea into the commission, the closest thing the American underworld ever had to a government. To Luciano, violence was not a display of strength. It was a failure of strategy. War was expensive. Bodies drew attention. Emotion clouded judgment. Control came from discipline, from predictability, from removing the unstable pieces before they detonated. And yet, even in this cold, mechanical world he shaped, there was a quiet tension building, a single flaw in the system he envisioned, a man who refused to obey the rules that kept everyone alive. Dutch Schultz. Luciano watched him the way a seasoned chess player watches a piece that won't stay on its square. Not with anger. Anger was for amateurs, but with a heavy certainty that the board would never be stable while that piece remained unpredictable. He saw the paranoia creeping into Schultz's decisions. He saw the impulsivity, the recklessness disguised as ambition. He saw the danger spreading, thin at first, then unmistakable. Luciano understood something most men didn't. You cannot reason with instability. You can only prepare for the moment it forces your hand. For him, Schultz wasn't just a nuisance. He was a fracture in the foundation, a risk to the entire structure he had spent years crafting, a storm disguised as a man, and storms, no matter how loud, eventually break against the calm. Schultz's instability wasn't merely irritating, the narrator's voice settles softly. It was a threat to the balance of the entire underworld. Long before the breaking point, the cracks were already spreading. Quietly, almost politely, through the corridors of the underworld. It started with conversations held in low voices, behind doors that never fully closed, where the glow of a cigarette was the only witness. Capos leaned in, exchanging looks heavy with concern, as if speaking Schultz's name too loudly might summon him. Everyone felt it. Something in Dutch Schultz had shifted from dangerous to unpredictable, and in their world, unpredictability was a contagion. Meetings became tense exercises in restraint. Men who once laughed easily now kept their eyes fixed on the floor, weighing each word before it left their mouths. In dimly lit back rooms beneath the steady hum of neon signs, soldiers whispered about Schultz's latest outbursts, fits of paranoia that came without warning, threats delivered with trembling hands, decisions made with the impulsivity of a man cornered by his own thoughts. Some swore they'd seen him talk to himself in reflective windows. Others claimed he slept with a gun on his chest and another under his pillow. None of it surprised anyone anymore. Schultz wasn't just unraveling, he was accelerating. And above all the murmurs, the fear, the suspicion, one truth floated to the surface like oil rising on dark water. If he kept spiraling, he wouldn't just endanger himself, he'd endanger everyone. The most alarming rumor arrived like a storm front, slow at first, then impossible to ignore. Schultz was planning something reckless, something catastrophic, something that would drag the entire commission into the shadows of a war they'd spent years preventing. He wanted to eliminate Thomas Dewey, a prosecutor protected by publicity, by public sympathy, by the watchful eyes of the entire city. Killing Dewey wouldn't just provoke outrage. It would bring the full weight of the government crashing down on every man in Luciano's world. In poorly lit bars, capos muttered the same sentence with a mixture of disbelief and dread. If Schultz does this, we're all finished. Through all this, lucky Luciano remained composed. He listened carefully, absorbing every detail, every whisper, every tremor in the voices of those reporting to him. There was no anger in his eyes, only the cold, reflective patience of a man watching a storm form on the horizon, knowing exactly where it would strike. Schultz was becoming a liability, a threat, a man steering himself and everyone around him toward a disaster he was too blinded to see. The storm hadn't hit yet, but the air already tasted like rain. In the final hours before everything collapsed, Dutch Schultz felt something tightening around him, something he couldn't name but couldn't escape. The world had taken on a strange, distorted clarity. Sound seemed louder, the smoke in the air seemed thicker, and every shadow in the room felt as if it were watching him with quiet judgment. Schultz sat at a small corner table in a bar that smelled of damp wood and old liquor. The light above him flickered as if unsure whether to reveal him or conceal him. His men watched from a distance, exchanging glances they thought he wouldn't notice. They saw the tremors at the edges of his movements, the way his fingers tapped rapidly against the table, the restless scanning of his eyes that never landed on any one thing for more than a second. Inside his mind, the noise was unbearable. Dewey is coming for you. The commission is hesitating. Luciano is planning something. No one is loyal anymore. If you don't act now, you're finished. The thoughts overlapped, circled, collided. Schultz couldn't distinguish between instinct and paranoia anymore. Fear and ego had blended into a single, volatile fuel. He stood abruptly. The chair scraped against the floor with a harsh shriek that made several men tense. Schultz didn't notice. He felt a pulse of certainty, false, fleeting, but powerful enough to override every warning. He convinced himself that only he understood the danger. Only he saw the urgency. Only he had the courage to act where others hesitated. In his mind, the cowardice of the commission, the caution of Luciano, the whispers behind his back, all of it became proof that he was the only one willing to protect the empire he claimed as his own. He imagined Dewey being eliminated. He imagined the newspapers unable to stop him. He imagined the underworld finally recognizing his dominance. It was a fantasy built on desperation. But Schultz held it tightly, as if the illusion itself could steady him. He walked toward the back of the room, the dim hallway narrowing around him like a tunnel. A door slammed somewhere in the building, echoing sharply. He flinched. His breath shortened. One of his men called after him, but Schultz dismissed him with a quick, irritated wave. Everything felt fragile. His control, his authority, his very identity. And when a man like Schultz feels himself slipping, the instinct is not to retreat. It's to prove, violently and impulsively, that he isn't afraid. He reached a decision in that hallway, under weak light, with the smell of stale tobacco clinging to the walls. A decision not spoken aloud, yet deafening in its consequences. He would go after Dewey, with or without the commission's approval, with or without Luciano's blessing, with or without loyalty from his own men. As he turned back toward the bar, something subtle shifted. The men watching him looked uneasy, unsure if they should follow or flee. They didn't understand the plan. There wasn't one. They didn't understand the motive. There wasn't clarity. All they saw was a man whose own fear had begun steering him. Schultz's hand trembled as he adjusted his coat. He didn't notice that either. This was not strategy, not leadership, not power. It was the final misstep of a man blinded by the illusion of his own necessity. The narrator lingers on the moment, letting it echo. He pulled the thread that held the entire underworld in balance, and never realized he had pulled the thread of his own life. When word reached Lucky Luciano, it didn't arrive with panic or urgency. It came quietly, carried by a man who hesitated at the doorway before entering, as if crossing an invisible threshold. Luciano was seated in a modest back room, the kind where a single lamp cast long, deliberate shadows across the walls. He didn't look up immediately. He let the silence breathe first. That was Luciano's way. Let the world speak before he did. When he finally raised his eyes, the messenger felt the weight of that calm gaze settle over him. He explained what Schultz intended, the plan, the recklessness, the certainty with which Dutch believed he had the right, no, the obligation, to act alone. Luciano didn't react, not a blink, not a shift in posture. He simply listened, his hands folded loosely, as if he were hearing the predictable conclusion to a story he had already memorized. In truth, he had been waiting for this moment. He knew Schultz's spiral wouldn't end in hesitation. It would end in defiance, and defiance, in their world, carried a cost no one could afford, especially now, when Dewey's spotlight was illuminating every shadow the underworld depended on. Luciano dismissed the messenger with a nod, slow and almost gentle. Then he sat in the quiet for a long moment, letting the room settle around him. Outside, footsteps passed, muffled by the hallway carpet. Voices drifted faintly, low and cautious. The world continued, unaware that a single decision in this room would shift powers and carve destinies. He lit a cigarette, drew in a steady breath, and exhaled with the precision of someone clearing the fog from his own thoughts. His mind moved like clockwork, methodical, unemotional. Schultz had crossed a line, and a line crossed once would be crossed again. Luciano called for Meyer Lansky. Lansky arrived quietly, coat damp from the mist outside. He entered without ceremony, closing the door behind him with deliberate care. These two men didn't need long explanations. Their conversations existed in the subtle spaces between sentences. "He's gone too far," Lansky said softly, almost regretfully. Luciano nodded. "The commission won't tolerate this," Lansky added. Luciano nodded again. Silence stretched, but it wasn't empty. It was a negotiation between two minds built for strategy, each one weighing consequences, possibilities, fallout. "Is it personal?" Lansky asked, though he already knew the answer. "No," Luciano replied, his voice level, untouched by emotion. "It's necessary." There it was, the quiet verdict. Luciano's decisions never arrived with anger or theatrics. They were crafted the way surgeons prepare for an incision. Remove only what threatens the patient. Nothing more, nothing less. No wasted motion, no lingering hesitation. A man like Dutch Schultz wasn't punished. He was diagnosed, and Luciano had just determined the cure. The rest unfolded in ritualistic precision. Men were contacted. Meetings held with coded language. Agreements solidified through nods rather than signatures. Everyone understood the gravity. No one questioned the outcome. They trusted Luciano's judgment because his calm was a compass, steady, unshakable, always pointing toward survival. When the lamp flickered overhead, Luciano finally stood. He adjusted his coat, exhaled a final ribbon of smoke, and spoke the words that sealed everything. It's done. Not a threat, not a boast. Simply the acknowledgement of an inevitable conclusion. When Luciano finally spoke, no one contested. The sentence was written, and Schultz still had no idea. Dutch Schultz always imagined his end would come in a hail of sound, shouting, gunfire, chaos ripping through a room the way storms tear through trees. In his mind, the world feared him too much to let him go quietly. But fate is rarely theatrical. It prefers irony. And it came for him with a silence he never expected. He was seated in a modest restaurant that evening, a place whose walls carried the smell of cabbage, old grease, and conversations murmured through decades. The lighting was warm, almost kind, softening the hard lines of the men who occupied the few tables scattered around. Schultz looked strangely at ease, as if he had convinced himself his impulsive plan had shifted the balance in his favor. But beneath that ease, there was a tremor, small, almost invisible, but unmistakable to anyone who had watched his unraveling. His eyes darted from corner to corner, checking exits, reading faces that didn't deserve suspicion. His hand hovered near his coat, not out of confidence, but out of fear he could no longer suppress. Outside, the night pressed against the windows, heavy with fog. It blurred the street lamps into soft halos, made the sidewalk seem farther away than it truly was. Cars rolled by slowly, their engines humming like distant warnings. Then the door opened. Not abruptly, not violently, just opened. The cold air slipped in first, carrying the faint scent of rain and something older, something metallic that had no business mixing with the restaurant's warmth. Schultz barely looked up. His men did, though, and something in their posture changed. Subtle, tense, instinctive. The figures who entered didn't rush, didn't posture, didn't seek attention. They moved with the precision of men carrying out a decision already settled long before they stepped inside. They didn't look at Schultz with anger or satisfaction. They didn't need to. This was not revenge. It was resolution. Schultz realized the truth a heartbeat too late. The air seemed to thicken around him. The sounds of the room blurred, the clinking of glasses, the shuffle of shoes, the murmured conversations, all fading into a muted hum. He tried to rise, but his legs hesitated, as if betraying the man who had spent years demanding absolute obedience from everyone around him. The moment stretched, fragile and thin as cracked glass. A life built on fear was now swallowed by it. As the scene unfolded, the city outside continued without pause. A taxi honked. A woman laughed somewhere down the block. A neon sign flickered. Life moved on, indifferent to the collapse happening inside one small room. Schultz sank back into his chair, breath unsteady, eyes wide not with anger, but with the bitter recognition of a truth he had spent his entire life running from. The danger he feared most had never been out there. It had always been inside him. Not Luciano's order, not the commission's verdict, not the men now standing before him. It was his own impulse, wild, frantic, uncontrollable, that had paved the road to this ending. In the end, it wasn't Luciano who destroyed him. It was the very impulse he never learned to contain. When Dutch Schultz's name finally drifted through the city like a fading echo, the underworld felt something shift. Subtle, but unmistakable. His fall didn't erupt with spectacle. It settled like a heavy truth everyone had long suspected. A truth waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. In the days that followed, whispers replaced panic. Men gathered in narrow rooms where dust floated in shafts of muted light, speaking softly about the recklessness that had nearly dragged them all into the fire. There was no triumph in their voices, No satisfaction, only a quiet recognition that the world they moved in had rules older and harsher than the men who broke them. Schultz had lived by impulse, and impulse had claimed its debt. The balance he once threatened now realigned itself with almost eerie precision. Luciano's influence didn't expand with force, it expanded with acceptance. The underworld understood that calm minds would govern its future, not volatile ones. The commission became more than an idea. It became the anchor around which everything else revolved. Those who once admired Schultz's audacity learned to fear what it represented. His downfall became a warning, repeated in dimly lit corners. Power without restraint eventually collapses under its own weight. Soldiers sharpened their discipline. Capos measured their words more carefully. Even the boldest men reconsidered decisions made in the heat of anger. Through all of it, Luciano remained composed. His expression never betrayed pride or relief. To him, the outcome had never been about victory. It had been about restoring order to a world that survived only through equilibrium. He understood that an empire built on chaos cannot stand. Only one built on control can endure. The city moved on in its patient, indifferent rhythm, but something lingered in the air. A reminder carried in the hush of conversations, in the heavy stillness of back rooms, in the way men watched one another with renewed caution. Dutch Schultz became a story told not for entertainment, but for instruction, a caution etched into the darker corners of memory. The underworld does not forgive men who mistake impulse for power, and history never forgets the ones who pay the price.